What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Sit Down Saturday. And today we're going to do the past, present, and future of BadCube, which I think is one really worth talking about and exploring a bit. A lot of interesting moves, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of inconsistency with striving for consistency, and I think it's going to be one worth looking into in some detail. House cleaning, the four dummies scalping for one. Some interesting points. I would get into it, in a healthy discourse manner with anyone about that, and that's really what I enjoy from this. Do you know what I mean? Is I enjoy creating the conversation. People think I'm trying to just stir the pot, but I'm not. I'm just trying to get people to start talking and hopefully staying civil with one another while talking. I understand that some things are too much to dream for, but to just start talking about this hobby that we all enjoy and talking about it in an adult manner, since we're mostly adults, and therefore in a civil manner. Very easy. But there's some interesting points in that one. Thank you for the comments. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with BadCube, that kind of came out of nowhere, but stuck around for the long haul in an era that was pretty cutthroat. But, as you all know, in order to talk about BadCube, we must first go back in time. And our journey begins with their first attempt at Huffer, which by and large was received well and positively. However, it did have issues. There were numerous accounts of paint issues as well as stability of the joints, namely in the hips and ankles, I believe. Now, I never had this figure, and I honestly never had the chance to review it either. But the general consensus was positive, however, not without issue. It was going up at the time against X-Transbot's Crank, and that's what I went with, ironically, during that period. The issues didn't go unnoticed by BadCube, though, and shortly thereafter they switched factories, and it is my understanding that they switched factories to the Make Toys factory. I don't know that to be true, but it was the scuttlebutt at the time. And to be fair, ever since then, the product was more consistent and better built, much like most of Make Toys products. So that does make sense to me. And honestly, this rumor went hand in hand with their next release, which has never been so evident as the materials used on this, which was BadCube's Brawny and Backland, which was their take on Brawn and Outback. Far superior to their Cubex in terms of build, but also there was a materials change. And those materials did seem as though they were on par with what Make Toys was using at the time. Now, also going hand in hand with this was the improved build. And this definitely helped solidify the more positive elements of their reputation that was building at the time, and in turn help ease the pain of the negative elements that were circulating about them at the time. So this really was a leveler, which begins to set a trend of the 2-for-1 mold release, which we'll get back to later. And they were both solid efforts. However, they weren't quite out of the controversy yet, as their next release ended up kind of defining what the major criticism ends up being for this company from this point forward. And that was BadCube's War Dog, a beautiful looking piece. The alt mode is still unparalleled in my opinion. The robot mode was modern with G1 nods and homages, but it was keeping with the relative standard of the time of applying a hyper-real alt mode and then manipulating that to what would it look like in robot mode, which I still kind of dig. But the transformation was a disaster. To this day, it is one of the most unpleasant transformations I have ever dealt with. While this figure was sort of regarded highly, and still is to some extent, the transformation preceded the reputation and subsequently became the standard bearer for the company as a whole. And with their third release, they found themselves perhaps even deeper in the woods. Which brings us to their Insecticons. Now, the charm to this release was that they released all three at the same time. However, it was going up against Fans Toys' Bombshell, which to this day remains one of the most impressive third-party pieces I've ever bought. Now, I never reviewed these either, but I did have the opportunity to mess with them briefly one year at TFCon Toronto, and I wasn't really impressed. They seemed a little lightweight, and they seemed a little flimsy, but the transformation was a bit of an improvement, and the sculpt kind of remained consistent with the level of quality that they had been doing up until this point. But it wasn't until their next release where they really found their stride, and that was with Sun
Sun Surge, which while I think is inferior to the Takara Masterpiece, I have to admit I don't think the Masterpiece knocks it out of the park. It just beats it humbly. This is when all of the moving pieces that BadCube had kind of been messing with, toying around in good sculpts, toying around in some paint, toying around in good articulation, toying around with different materials, kind of fell into the right pocket. And in my opinion, this is where they've kind of coasted ever since. They also released a repaint, a red version of Sun Surge. Shortly after that, they released their largest figures to date, which were the Hoist and Trailbreaker attempts. And they made some interesting choices in order to try to get both to work, but I have to honestly say that these two bots, while sharing a mold, are interesting because I feel like most companies either got one right or the other. BadCube, I feel like to this day, has still released the best third-party Trailbreaker, whereas, in comparison, I feel like X-Transbots has released the best third-party Hoist. But all things being equal, the transformation, while involved, never fell into the depths of frustration that War Dog plummeted. There was more paint on these figures than we had seen previously, good weight, build, and construction, and decent sculpts. After that, they released their smallest figures, their Gears and Swerve, which I think most people still have as their stand-in representations of those two characters. This, I think, was the release I was most looking forward to, and probably the release I was most disappointed by. Not that there was anything necessarily inherently wrong with them, and I still think they look fine on a shelf, but some of the building blocks that they had been laying down for the past year or so suddenly seemed stripped from underneath their feet. We didn't get a lot of paint. The transformation started slipping into aggravating places, even though the figures were smaller and should have been simpler. And the Swerve just couldn't incorporate the use of a retool to pull off the sculpt successfully, and much like Ralphie in A Christmas Story, became somewhat of a pink nightmare. But all in all, it was a small dip in their overall reputation as they released their Huff 2.0, which they had been promising for some time, which was an updated release with their current factory standards with some slight retooling of their original Huffer. I didn't plan on getting this figure as I didn't imagine it would have been that much better than the Crank, and had to eat my words subsequently after, and even admitted it within the review that I knew it had to be done.
Really does. If I were... Look at those joints just fail before your eyes. Unreal. Anyway, if I cared more about the character, I'd probably swap him out, and maybe I will swap him out at some point. But as for right now, I'm probably not going to swap him out, but the more, I'm going to be honest with you, the more I'm looking at him, the more I feel like I have to. I guess I gotta make that phone call. Either way, I think I'm gonna have to make that phone call. God bless America.
This figure felt like what the Grump and the Slick should have been. We also got a second use out of this mold, which sort of became the standard with their take on pipes. That I think was interesting and good enough, but ultimately didn't feel as impressed by this as I did of the other, plus cared less about the character and didn't feel the need to replace the one I currently had, who has a floppy mess of an arm. Normally, I would say their next release would be a company's most bizarre choice, but they had another one in store for me later on. They decided to re-tackle the characters of Red Alert and Sideswipe with molds that were far more consistent with the Sunbow models, but were also kind of going up against the Takara Plus versions. I wasn't sure if I thought this was going to be the right move for them, but I think that overall they were highly regarded. I thought they were good enough, but I definitely didn't feel like they were necessary to update your collection. I didn't feel as though they were that far superior. You can make the argument that they were more accurate to the G1 model, and I would agree, but I don't think that's personally enough to say they're superior. They're also still available to buy pretty much everywhere, so I'm not sure how they sold. Although, I know a lot of people swapped out their Takara versions with Steamroll and Recon, their updated takes on Sideswipe and Red Alert. And shortly after that, we got their most bizarre release to date, which was their Nature's line, Captain Huffy, which I had to do a Teases the Court episode on because I felt it was interesting enough to tackle. This was a much more unique take on Transformer characters, and I know this character has a bit of a reference somewhere as well, but all in all, it was a much more unique take on an OC. See how hip I am with the young kids? OC, original character. Never played online a day in my life, I'll have you know. Not unlike what we saw with the Unrustable Bastards. I don't honestly know how this figure did, but I don't feel like it it had the presence nor impact that their previous releases had. And I say that to say this. I think the future of BadCube is very questionable because of a string of poor decisions. Poor decisions that were moderately interrupted by solid releases, but poor decisions nonetheless that may have left for a mighty big question mark on what the future is of this company.
So where does this leave us in the future for BadCube? And the question is a question. It looks like they're definitely going to be exploring their Nature's line in more detail. It seems like that's where their passion is, and I get it, I'll circle back to that. However, they released an image of their next Nature's reveal back in September, and we haven't really heard anything from them since. But let's take a look at that. And it's namely BCN02T Red, which transforms into a spider and also into a tank and then into a robot. I looked through the comments on this in Facebook, and I gotta tell you, a lot of them were not positive. But BadCube responded in a manner that I did respect, with stuff like, we always make what we want to make. Won't change any decision we have for N and OTS line, 2 different teams making it. Let's take that on face value and say it's true. I'm not sure that it is. I'm sure that there are 2 teams working on it. I'm just not sure that the company can sustain the 3 lines of releases. It seems like they're having trouble maintaining one. There's 2 parts to this. The one part is my respect for them having a passion and following the passion and doing what they want. I'd be lying to you if I told you that I don't get a lot of comments, PMs, DMs, etc. saying stuff like, I hate 4 Dummies, or I hate Sit Down Saturday. I wish you wouldn't do it. I'm gonna stop watching if you don't stop doing it. And the truth is, stop watching. Because I'm not doing this as my full-time job, for one. I'm doing this because I still want to do this, and I like the discussions, so that's what I'm doing. And it seems like that's what they're doing as well. It's a matter of passion. It's a matter of want. It's a matter of following their heart. And I got news for you. It's probably not their 9 to 5 either. So I do respect it. Now, the problem with that is you have to have the product to back up that stance. Here's the thing. Stan Lee used to always say, he used to get fan letters to write in that would say, kill Aunt May or I'll never buy another Spider-Man comic. But for every one of those he got at least one other saying, if you ever touch Aunt May, I'll never buy another Spider-Man comic. So Aunt May stuck around, they put her in jeopardy, they took her in, they put her out, etc., etc., etc. But guess what? The product was strong enough that it kept the audience from front to back. Because it's Spider-Man, one of the most popular superheroes of all time. BadCube is not Spider-Man. So the question is going to come to, can the business maintain the passion? I deal with it myself. I do the drawing stuff, and I have a business that I run regarding that, and I do a lot of stuff that I know is going to do well. I'm working on something soon that I'm like, this is going to perform very well. And I want to do it, but it's not what I want to do right now. What I want to do right now is something totally different, but I know it won't sell the same. So one has to find a balance within their hobbies or passions or entrepreneurial endeavors to balance the business and the passion, because if one doesn't support the other, unfortunately both will crumble. For instance, I did the Shockwave piece not too long ago, and I'd always wanted to do that. I'd always wanted to do Shockwave sitting on a throne of Autobots. And then later on, I did a Ravage in Skywarp, which was a commission, but I knew it would perform well. But what I wanted to do at that time was I wanted to do a Darkseid and Grail piece, which I did. Did it perform well? No. Did I know it wasn't going to perform well? Of course. My community is built on the backs of Transformers. I get it. But because Shockwave does well, and because Skywarp and Ravage do well, I'm able to do my passion at that moment, which was Darkseid and Grail. And I'm not sure that BadCube is striking that balance. They have to be careful, because we haven't seen anything from them since September. The last 2 reveals have been less than stellar, and I can still get the red alert and Sideswipe on pretty much every distributor in North America. So I'm not sure how the business is doing. Now, of course, if they've sold it to those distributors in America, BadCube made that money back to them. But the question is, if those distributors bought 100 pieces and they were only able to sell 50, what do those distributors buy from BadCube on the next release? That's the problem. BadCube needs to find the balance. I respect the passion. I respect following your heart. But if they want to stay a player, they're going to have to feed the fish. And the fish want G1 most of the time, for better or worse. And I feel their pain maybe more than most, but I get it. And you have to navigate that in order to stick around. But I wish them the best. I think there's merit in this company, and I'd like for them to continue on succeeding, and I'd like them to continue with their passions. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.